All right, welcome everyone to my presentation. Today I'll be presenting my AP research on women and women of color in college coaching. I'd first like to begin with the purpose of my research. Slides are working. There we go. I would first like to begin with the purpose of my research. The purpose of this report is to examine the inclusion of women and women of color head coaches in NCAA Division-I women's soccer athletic programs within the Power Five conferences during the 2020-2021 academic school year. This report also investigates the occupational turnover of Division-I soccer head coaches within the Power Five conferences from 2012 to 2021 by the breakdown of race and gender for the outgoing and incoming coaches, and by evaluating if a relationship exists with this race, gender, and winning percentage of the outgoing coach in relation to the race and gender of the incoming coach. So why does this report matter? Well, women coaches are a statistical minority in nearly all sports at all levels. Intercollegiate athletics have continued to develop a reputation that privileges men over women by maintaining what is known as a gender hierarchy. And although female athletic participation has increased tremendously in the United States due to the passing of Title IX, female head coaches of female intercollegiate teams has actually decreased from 90% in 1974 to about only 43% today. As for women of color, their double minority status is often overlooked and marginalized as an underrepresented social group, and therefore they are nearly absent in sports research. Explorations of single aspects of identity consistently center on certain groups at the exclusion of others. So for example, white women are immensely focused on in explorations of gender, while men of color are dominantly referenced in examinations of race. And it is necessary to understand women of color coaches' experiences beyond one-dimensional interpretation for analysis as people of color or women in order to correctly identify identity's influences on women of color coaches' experiences and opportunities. But why do women and women of color coaches matter? To begin, same identity coaches matter. Coaches serve as role models for all athletes, and having gender and racial diversity is critical to challenge gender stereotypes and racial discrimination about women and women of color in leadership. Secondly, women have access to fewer examples of high-profile, motivating same-gender and race athletic role models than men. Female athletes are inspired by examples of highly successful women in sport, like coaches, because these role models display that athletic success and leadership is achievable. Third, by increasing the number of women and women of color head coaches, girls and young women will acknowledge coaching as a legitimate career path, as they can see people who look like them within this profession. And finally, women coaches are significant to the development of other women coaches through their interaction. I now will proceed on to the contribution my research makes to the field of study regarding women in sport. My research goals contribute by focusing on the sport of soccer specifically, rather than looking at all sports together when assigning grades to each of the Power Five conferences. Additionally, because previous report cards have not been centered on women of color, my research adds to the conversation by providing a separate grade for the inclusion of women of color head coaches. For the second part of my research goal, I have uniquely investigated occupational turnover by examining the intersections of race and gender and winning as a function of predicting who will be hired next. Overall, this study provides new insights and knowledge on hiring, retention, and racial and gendered patterns of the employment within soccer. My initial hypothesis going into this study was most of the soccer head coaches at the NCAA Division-I level were made predominantly of white men, and therefore the conferences would have lower grade assignments. I now will transition on to my methodology in terms of my data collection. So first off, let's talk about the coding key. So this coding key was utilized by myself, and it was developed by the Tucker Center for Research on Girls and Women in Sport to examine the first research goal under consideration. And the reason why I chose this coding key was because it consisted of various variables, including conference, institution, and gender, with numeric assignments for the variations within each category. So for example, this image shows the conference variable with the number 1 assigned to the ACC, the number 2 to the Big 12, and so forth. And then I specifically added in the race variable so I could assess the inclusion of women of color. And the variables that I collected included the first and last name of the head coach, the conference, the institution, the gender and race, and I did that all in an Excel spreadsheet, as you can see here. And how this data was found was I visited each of the institution's athletic websites and I reviewed their head coach biography for the women's soccer program. So here's an example of the University of Minnesota soccer head coach on the institution's athletic website. And gender was determined by the examination of photograph and the examination of the gender markers in the accompanying biographical text. And race was determined by the examination of the photograph, the last name, and the biographical text. So now I'm going to talk about why I use the Power Five conferences. So the Power Five conferences include 65 institutions that make up the 5 largest, affluent, and most popular conferences in college athletics in the United States. So I decided to go with these Power Five conferences, and they consist of the Big 10, the Big 12, the Pac-12, ACC, and the SEC. And for the second part of my research goal, the Tucker Center's previous Power Five longitudinal data was included as well. And the reason why I included this data was because it indicated whether occupational turnover had occurred, as well as all the sports for the head coaches. And so then I uploaded this data set into SPSS and I filtered it in order to fit the parameters of soccer occurring and then occupational turnover occurring. And that resulted in 31 occupational turnovers from 2012 to 2021 for the soccer head coaches. And once I had these occupational turnovers documented, I coded again the race and gender for the outgoing and incoming coaches using that previous methodology I mentioned. And then in order to collect the winning percentage for the outgoing coaches, I visited the institution's athletic website and I looked at their historical statistics. So as you can see in this image, this is Iowa State Soccer's historical statistics, and it's a screenshot of a portion of the statistics in a PDF. And when calculating the percentage for the winning for the outgoing coaches, all the seasons that the coach was at that institution was accounted for. So the equation I used for this was I took their total wins at that institution divided by the sum of their wins and losses at this institution. So this image reflects the recording and calculations of the winning percentage of Wendy Dellinger, and she's at Iowa State Soccer. Now that I've covered the data collection, let's move on to the data analysis. After obtaining all the data, it was imported into IBM SPSS statistics in order to run analysis. And descriptive frequency distributions and crosstabs on conference, gender, and race was run. And the method I chose for this was doing the descriptive frequencies. And the reason why I did this was because it provided percentages, and those percentages could then be applied to the grading scales for gender and race. So now you may be wondering what those grading scales were and how I assign these grades. So first, let's begin with the gender grading scale. So this grading criteria for gender breakdown followed the scale that has been used by the Tucker Center for several years in their report cards. And this scale was selected by myself because it reflects the reality of the stagnation of women coaches, and it holds entities accountable for their hiring practices. And after running the descriptive statistics, the following percentages and grades were found. Based on these gender grades, it is evident that women's soccer coaches are a minority for all of the Power Five conferences, occupying less than 50% of head coach positions. And when we compare this to the letter grade D nationally for the inclusion of Division-I women's soccer head coaches at 25.3%, 3 of the Power Five conferences, the ACC, Big 12, and Pac-12, had a lower grade assignment with the letter grade F. As for the grading criteria of the racial minority breakdown, the scale that was followed was used by the Institute for Diversity in Ethics in Sport, and they've also used this for several years and created it for their report card. The racial grading scale was selected because it reflects the nation's minority demographic suggested by the federal affirmative action policies, in which workplaces should reflect the percentages of groups within the population. After running descriptive statistics, it was evident that women of color are not represented at all in any of the Power Five conferences, with 0%. My initial hypothesis was correct of all the Power Five conferences because they all had a low gender assignment and racial grade assignment, reflecting a white male-dominated soccer coaching workforce. This lack of representation of women, and especially women of color head coaches, is a major concern due to the fact that the Power Five conferences' status in collegiate athletics in the United States. They create an appearance of an environment that does not value the inclusion of women and women of color coaching collegiate soccer, and that then influences other conferences and divisions to do the same. These assigned grades are super important because they generate awareness by documenting evidence-based starting positions in hopes to hold conference commissioners accountable and athletic directors accountable. And what I mean by that is they can be held accountable to create a more balanced gender and race force in soccer. And more specifically, conference commissioners and athletic directors can advocate for women and women of color coaches. They can track the progress and compete with other Power Five conferences with the use of these grades. They can be motivated to think more deeply about how they recruit, hire, and retain women and women of color coaches. And they can be inspired to create a culture where women and women of color coaches are appreciated. For the second part of my research goal, I again used IBM SPSS statistics to run frequency distributions for the turnover demographics, and I used binary logistic regression analysis to create two models to examine the relationship between the sex, race, and winning percentage of the outgoing coach in correlation to the sex and race of the incoming coach. So these two graphs here display the percentages for each of the social groups of the outgoing and incoming coaches. This data showcases and concludes that homologous reproduction continues to privilege white men head coaches within the Power Five soccer programs. And the failure to address systematic inequalities and gender and racial bias in collegiate athletics against women and women of color is likely the reason that drastic upward mobility for the percentage of women and women of color is lacking, as we can see in the percentages within these social groups. Now, moving on to the occupational turnover in depth, here we can see that there were 23 out of 31 missed opportunities for women and 31 of 31 missed opportunities for women of color to fill these head coaching positions for soccer. And this data emphasizes the significance of athletic directors taking the opportunities to hire women and women of color coaches when vacancy occurs in order to increase that percentage. Binary logistic regression analysis was also used to create two models to examine the relationship of sex, race, and winning percentage of the outgoing coach in correlation to the sex and race of the incoming coach. So the reason why I chose binary logistic regression analysis was because it allowed for me to use several predictor variables that could be either categorical or numeric and a binary dependent variable. So model one included the winning percentage, sex, and race of the outgoing coach with the dependent variable of sex for the incoming coach. And model two did a similar thing, but with the dependent variable, it was the race of the incoming coach. And after analysis, neither model one or model two had a p-value that was significant to predict the sex or race of the incoming coach. However, these insignificant results may be due to the fact that there was a small sample size and the skew of the data, as 70% of the outgoing and incoming coaches were in fact white men. The dominance of white male soccer head coaches for outgoing and incoming coaches in this data proves a lack of diversity for soccer head coaches that continues to exist as time moves forward. Athletic directors and conference commissioners can use this research data to inspire the necessary conversation needed to prioritize the practice of hiring and retaining women and women of color soccer head coaches. There were some limitations in this study that are worth mentioning. So for example, with the data collection, the racial and gender coding that I mentioned previously in this presentation, there is a possibility for identification bias as the researcher. And then additionally, categorizing all women of color in one section prevents the examination of the different races individually. However, due to the absence of women of color, there are not enough varying races of women of color yet to examine them separately, but hopefully in the future when that number increases, that examination can occur. And finally, like I mentioned previously, the small sample size for the occupational turnover may have prevented the significant results in the binary logistic regression. This leads me on to the further research that is possible. To begin, because the study only examined the Power Five conferences for soccer, future studies can expand further by looking at all of Division-I conferences and providing grades, as well as Division-II and Division-III for soccer. Additionally, further research can be done on sport-specific grades. So what I mean by that is basketball, hockey, softball, there's a bunch of different sports that could follow the same methodology for grade assignments for both women and women of color. And once those grade assignments are given, we can look at sports that are getting high grades, so A and Bs, for example, and sports that aren't getting as good grades, so Cs and Ds, And we can see what they are doing differently to provide inclusion for women and women of color. And those strategies can be identified by researchers in the future. And finally, because this study had small amount of occupational turnover within that sample size for the logistic regression, it could be expanded further by including all the Division-I conferences for the occupational turnover in efforts to increase that sample size to be greater than 31. I'd finally like to conclude with my personal connection to this project. So as a female soccer player of color, it is really upsetting to see the low visibility of people who look like me within this profession. And my hope is that my research inspires this conversation to increase the visibility of role models for soccer players like me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramira. As you know, you've had an opportunity to prepare for these oral defense questions, and I'll ask you one question from each category. The research process, your depth of understanding, and reflection on the inquiry process. And just so I can see you better, would you mind not sharing your screen so I can see more of you? Thank you. Excellent. So my first question is actually to add on to what you were just finishing with. You mentioned kind of like how future research could proceed from here. And I'm wondering if you can give some specific examples of how your findings provide direction for that future research.
Sure, yeah. So for example, in previous report cards, a lot of them include, so for the Tucker Center, for example, they put for the conferences all of the sports together and they assign one grade. So my goal in this research was to fill that gap in by providing sport-specific feedback. So looking at soccer individually, I was able to assign grades for both women and women of color. And women of color is a new aspect because previous report cards actually haven't looked at their social group. And so my hope is that future research can look into these different sports. So for example, if they looked into basketball and they saw basketball is achieving really well with their grade assignments, what are they doing differently in comparison to soccer? So if they're achieving at an A level, what are their hiring practices? What are they doing to retain women and women of color? And compare that to what soccer is doing. And hopefully in the future, researchers can find and investigate those hiring practices by talking to conference commissioners and by talking to athletic directors and interviewing them to see specifically what those conferences are doing.
Thank you. My next question is, how did the choices you made when designing and implementing your research method impact your research process itself?
That's a great question. So actually, when I began the research process in the beginning, I kind of had this idea that research was a straight line and I would continuously work and I would come up with a research question, I'd have my data collection and my analysis. Obviously, that was not the case. At the beginning of the research process, I originally wanted to assign grades to all of the conferences in the United States for soccer. I wanted to figure out how they were hiring people well. I had all these ideas that I wanted to do. And Dr. Lavoie had to go like, hold on, take a step back. You can't do all of those things all at once in the time frame of your project. So I had to work on actually condensing my research question and figuring out how to modify it as time went on. And I think another thing that I learned was your research question often modifies. So an example of this was when I was looking at occupational turnover, originally I was just going to look at the 2020-2021 academic year in comparison to the 2019-2020 academic year. And I only found 4 occupational turnovers. And at that time it was January. So I was stressed out. I was like, oh my gosh, like I don't know what I'm going to do. So we took a step back and I said, how can I modify this research question so I can have a larger sample size? And after brainstorming, I was able to come up with the idea of using a longitudinal progression for the research question. So then I looked back into 2012 all the way to 2021, and I was able to increase that sample size. So I think going through the process, the most important thing that I learned was that modification and that continuous transition from one research question to the next.
Great. And my final question for you is, how did you handle uncertainty in the research process?
Yeah, so like I mentioned with that, again, with that occupational turnover, that was a big like roadblock because I was like, oh my gosh, it's January. I have to submit this paper soon. I have to figure out what to do. So I think the most important thing that I learned is patience with the progress. I really struggled at the beginning with like developing a research question and not having that straight line of, okay, here's the research question, here's the answer. Because when you do like a math problem, for example, it's straightforward, but research, that's not the way that it works. You're going to have roadblocks along the way. And I think the way I dealt with the uncertainty specifically was talking with Dr. Lavoie. And I really had the luxury of also working with the Tucker team. And with the Tucker team, I was able to have monthly meetings with them, and we discussed about these current events and these current topics. And I could discuss my research as well as they could talk about their research. And I was able to expand on ideas and kind of my knowledge overall. So I think that support system was really great in my first research process. And then also just understanding and continuing to work and develop my process as I went on, and figuring out, it doesn't have to be perfect every time. You can make adjustments and it'll end up good in the end.
Outstanding. I'm going to stop recording now.